May the words of our mouths, the thoughts in our hearts, and our actions be giving glory to you, God, in all of your creation. Please be seated. Well, welcome to Bright Sunday. For centuries, it's been the tradition in the church that the Sunday after Easter is called Bright Sunday. It's a time to sort of catch up with ourselves, to refresh ourselves from the lament of Lent and the triumph of Easter and regroup for what's ahead. It's a time really for us to be thinking about, where are we going to go next? And where does the story carry for us in our lives? Interestingly, this Sunday is also known in Latin as Risus Paschalis. That means laughing Easter. Now, why laughing Easter? Well, that's because God really created the greatest joke of all time in raising Christ from the dead. Because the authorities and the priests had thought, wow, he didn't even resist us during the trial. This is an easy thing. It's all going to be done and over. But no, there was something much more surprising for us to be experiencing and to be learning about. And that's what we're going to be talking about today is where do we go with this? How do we look at this for our lives? And what can we be doing to approach this? Now, the gospel for today, Doubting Thomas, really sort of struck me at heart. I chose to preach on this Sunday in part to give some relief to our overworked clergy. But I came upon the gospel and I said, wow, I can really identify with Doubting Thomas. Because I've been trained to doubt. When I was growing up, I was in the Sputnik era. Some of you may remember that, when there was this huge rush of training in the math and science. And I loved math and science because it had answers. I did experiments. There were proofs that I could come up with in theorems and other things that I could have confidence in. And that this was something that I could do and that I could be on top of. And it carried over into high school debate, where I learned, how to take one side and how to take another side, and to argue it in equal ways. And in the course of that, there kind of became a sense that, truth and whatever is sort of fungible. It's kind of like which side you take. And of course, we're seeing that in spades, aren't we, in so many areas in our culture right now. And then in law school, I continued the arc of doubt with more training in how to advocate for a position and using laws and facts and coming forward and being impactful in how we made our case to somebody. And then on in business school and in business endeavors, I noted how people would often, when confronted with a new option for something, they would say, well, let me be the devil's advocate for a moment. Remember hearing that? People say, let me be the devil's advocate. What a concept. That that's what we're going to do is we're going to think how would the devil think about this idea that somebody's putting forth? Rarely, if ever, did I hear anybody say, that they were being Christ's advocate. What would Christ say? Now, there was a whole group of people that went with, what would Jesus do and use that to advocate for their various positions, often with the faith and sometimes in a much more exclusive way about the faith. But what it really did for me is this insistence became a way for me to challenge, insistence on facts, on the doubts, became a way for me to challenge and avoid things that I was uncomfortable with. And change is often uncomfortable, even a little change of how our seats are arranged. And so, how do we face this? How do we deal with this? And how do we, in particular, approach the conversion of life that Lindsay is guiding us in terms of following what Christ is calling us to do? So I fear that I and others like me have become people that are doubt-first rather than faith-first followers of Christ. We come at it as Thomas did. Prove it to me. Let me touch it. Let me see it. Let me experience it. And we've become very polarized, and we've lost and squeezed out some of the mystery and the joy and the inevitability, if you will, of our faith and of God's presence in us, which is far beyond anything that we can conceive. So how do we ever think we're going to get our heads around something that is far bigger than us. So this is especially the case, when unlike Thomas, we can't physically touch the risen Christ. So what do we do then if we're in this doubting culture and we face that kind of situation? Well, oftentimes I find it very helpful to get a different perspective on things, to kind of change my thinking about the world, sometimes intentionally, sometimes it happens unintentionally, by having an experience that gets beyond what my experience has been. And I found that last year when I went to Bhutan. Bhutan is a country nestled in the towering Himalayan mountains. It's a modern-day anomaly. Their metric for success is gross national happiness, not gross domestic product or whatever else. And their core values are compassion and contentment. Compassion for each other, compassion for the land and the resources, and a contentment, not a lackadaisical contentment, but a contentment with what they have rather than the constant striving for what they might have or what someone else has. So how does such a radical view of life, akin to what we aspire to as Christians, if you will, compassion, contentment, and so on, thrive? How do they do that in their culture, and what might we learn from that? Well, first, among the Buddhists in Bhutan, all of creation is divine. The mountains, the streams, the creatures, large and small, animate and inanimate. We call inanimate things. But actually, the rocks even have the same atoms and molecules in them that our bodies do. They're just different arrangements. So they believe that there's deities in all of this creation. So they have that kind of broad view that creation is indeed a holy divine thing in its entirety. Second, they give voice to their aspirations. For example, visiting a temple, we came upon monks and townspeople who were gathering to chant 1,000,000 mantras for peace. An amazing kind of thing to experience. And you can imagine what might happen for people when they do that and they really intune themselves to that kind of view of what they intend. And third, they provide witness for their faith. So we were in the capital city, and there was a Buddhist teacher who was teaching the monks from the ancient teachings in a language that the common people do not understand, but the monks do, and revealing to them what those teachings provided. But there were 10,000 people gathered around those dozens of monks. And I thought to myself, why are they there, sitting there, listening to something that they don't understand? Well, in their culture, it's so critical that they give witness to their faith, that they are present in that experience, even if it's something they do not entirely comprehend. So the Bhutanese cultivate what I call a faith-first culture, rather than a doubt-first culture. Not that they're unthinking about things, they're not interested, or they're anti-science or anything else, but they start from that different place. And Western organizational leaders are telling us and really discovering that the most effective way for us to work as organizations is really with that kind of fields of shared consciousness, the kinds of things that the Bhutanese are trying to do amongst themselves and doing quite successfully. And the organizational leaders are seeing that there's a real need to restore and strengthen that kind of frayed fabric of culture and shared understanding that keeps us together. So what can we learn from this about creating a faith-first culture as followers of Christ? Especially in a time when we cannot physically touch the risen body of Christ. Although we'll speak about that in a moment. First, we need to see Christ's presence in all of creation. I've been really struck by some of the current theologians, Matthew Fox, Richard Rohr, who speak of the cosmic Christ, the universal Christ, the idea that actually Christ is in all of creation, not this kind of separate entity here that visited once that has gone off somewhere else, but is actually present to us, and we can find Christ in all situations. For me, I find, and this is why I'm involved with the Earth Care team here, I find a great connection with the cosmic or universal Christ, if you will, in nature. Because it's just amazing to me. Every time I just learn something more about how nature works and how plants think, they actually do, they solve problems for themselves, they do all kinds of things, that it always convinces me there is a greater spirit. There is a consciousness here that is much larger than me, much larger than any of us, that is imbuing our experience of life and can be tapped in our lives in a much more profound way. So that's one of the things that I think is important, is for each of us to find what is that connection that gives you that sort of resonance. It could be maybe a newborn baby. It could be, a piece of art. It could be something else that really kind of generates for you that sense of something beyond oneself. So that's number one. Number two is we need to value our practices of prayer, worship, singing, and reflection that enable us to center ourselves. Now, I've changed my attitude about church services here. Previously, I found the repetition, to the chagrin of much of prior clergy, the repetition of ancient scriptures and liturgies boring. I thought to myself, I've heard it before, and I'm someone who doesn't even go to a movie a second time. So like, what is this like showing up and the same thing happens? And what I've learned is that what I've come to appreciate and what I now value in our services and contemplative practices, the prayer beads, the other things we find to connect with, is they're fundamental to creating this field of faith first. That it's a way through these forms and these approaches for us to create a bulwark against the corrosive powers in our culture that lead us elsewhere. That this way of engaging in service, in liturgy, and in our understandings with each other is so important to be able to do this effectively. And the third thing I would highlight for us about finding Christ in our lives is we need one another. Faith is not a solo sport. We can't weave a new fabric in a frayed world with just one thread. We have a divine opportunity to be the people of God together for good. To go forth as people of faith in Christ is not for the faint of heart. We need to armor ourselves for the challenges we face. We need the assurance that Christ is ever with us. We are not alone. We can seek and find Christ in all situations, and that's our invitation. And I hope that you will join us in the discussion time after the service. We'll be talking about what your experiences are, what other people's experiences are, and how to make this connection with Christ in our lives today. And what are some of the ways that we can do that with and through our understanding of nature and earth care. So in a moment, I'm going to invite you to stand as you're able and join with me in the rousing conclusion to hymn 370. It's printed in your service bulletin. This hymn is called St. Patrick's Breastplate. It's an ancient Irish hymn to remind us of Christ's presence amidst the ills that befall us and our ability to call upon that presence in any circumstance. My longtime friends, Art and Judy Stevens, and spiritual directors with us today, and I'm so delighted that you're here. Thank you. Offered this hymn to me many decades ago as an antidote to my doubts and fears. And may the singing of this resonate within us as Christ's presence with and through us, and our opportunity to bring this message to a world that is hungering for God's unconditional love. So if you'd stand up for a moment and join us in this hymn. Amen.